You are listening to the Mark Guzman Podcast Experience. Thank you for coming on to the podcast. I will introduce the guest right now. It's Rob Lightner. He's with East Brother Beer Company in Richmond. And last December, Rob and his longtime business partner, Chris Coomer, opened up Richmond's latest addition to the Bay Area craft beer craze, East Brother Beer Company. Located on Canal Boulevard in Point Richmond, East Brother Beer Company offers 12,000 square feet of brewing space and a wide range of food trucks to pair with its list of beers. So thank you for coming on to the podcast.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Yeah. So I see you brought here 4 of your beers, and we're going to be fancy here and be drinking out of wine glasses.
Excellent.
Okay. So why don't we talk a little bit, before we get into the beer, let's talk a little bit about who you are, your background, and what got you involved with this company.
Yeah, it's a long story. How much time do you have?
We have time.
Chris and I go way back. We lived on the same street. We now live 2 blocks away from each other, but our kids are the same age. We actually have one kid in college and one in high school now. So our kids kind of grew up together. Our families, spent time camping and just hanging around and being neighbors and being friends, and we became close friends. And a number of years ago, Chris started to brew, homebrew. Chris is the kind of guy who gets a hobby and sinks his teeth into it and just goes all in, whether it's mountain biking or guitar playing. I was mentioning earlier, I play a little bit of drums. I got into drums because Chris was playing guitar, and we had a couple other friends who were playing. We didn't ever do anything more than just, mess around, playing songs together and having fun, basically.
Yeah.
But brewing was something that he settled on, and he was doing it at home. He started out with a small system, got a bigger system, started getting more into it, started getting more sophisticated. And when you're brewing, your friends come over and hang around,
They do,
especially on a Sunday. And I was one of the guys who was just always there. There was something, like I was the guy who hung around the most. Timing things for him and, going out and getting sandwiches and stuff like that. That was my role. But it's just fascinating, the brewing process, and it's fun. And he's the kind of guy who he's what you call an autodidact. He teaches himself. He watches, 100 YouTube videos and reads 20 books and just, digests all the information that's out there. And he's very obsessed. He's very scientific and, consumed with the details. And what came out was really, really good. So I kind of thought I should have known because I know him. But, you always assume homebrew. Okay, well, we'll go over there and we'll hold our noses and say something nice. And the very first batch he brewed, it was like, oh my God, that's really good. We don't have to say anything nice, artificially. We can be honest about it. And he just kept brewing these different styles and kept improving them little by little. And as I said, I was hanging around there a lot, and we had been, we both had our own careers. I've been in the corporate world, in sort of the for-profit and the nonprofit sectors. Chris has had his own company, retail store development for years and years. But we were both sort of, we're both in our early 50s. And actually, I think when we started talking about this, I was in my late 40s. It took a few years. But at one point, it just became clear, man, this beer is so good. We're both kind of ready to try something new. And one day Chris goes, you want to start a brewery? And without hesitation, I go, yes. And I was totally serious. It wasn't like, oh, sure. We've been drinking and we're saying whatever. It was like, no, I'm serious. Let's do it. So we got together the next morning and started planning, basically. That was in the summer of 2013. We opened the brewery in December of 2016. So it took about 3.5 years.
Okay.
Yeah, we actually started selling, distributing in late October and November, but then we opened our tap room in December.
Okay. So you're coming up on the 1-year anniversary for the tap room.
That's correct.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
I know it's really tough for a lot of businesses to even get to the 1 and 2 year marks. And You guys are doing a phenomenal job right now.
Well, it's been good so far, you know. So far, so good. There's a lot to, you know, we're insanely busy every day, and there's a lot to do. But so far, the beer's great. You know, we're happy with the beer, we're happy with the brand, and we're really happy with where we are.
Yeah. So how long did it take for him to brew and really perfect the craft before you actually tried the first beer he did at home?
Um, that's a good question. I mean, certainly months. I mean, it takes again months of research, you know, sort of an education. But then the brewing process itself is an education, right? So,
There's a lot involved.
uh, yeah. Well, it's funny. There's you're right. It, but at the same time, it's a very simple process. You know, brewing beer is basically taking four ingredients: malt, hops, water, and yeast, and you know, steeping the malt, getting the sugar out of the malts, and you know, steeping and boiling, putting some hops in, and then at the end putting the yeast in. The yeast eats the sugar, creates CO2 and alcohol, and you have beer. So like in concept, that's all it is. But to your point, the variations are infinite in terms of the amount of time you do it, and the temperatures, and the hop additions, and the kind of malts you use, and the kind of yeast, and how long you let it ferment. So there's like a million variations. So to answer your initial question, I mean it's always an education, right? You're always learning something every time you brew. It's like, oh, it came out this way because we did this. What do we learn from that, and how are we going to modify it for the next batch?
Yeah.
Now, at this point, we are, you know, consistency is very important because when someone cracks a can of this red lager, we want it to taste the same every single time. Now,
Yeah.
there are, of course, slight variations at this point in our early days, but consistency is very important.
Yep. So I'm excited for this episode because I'm a huge beer fan, but I've never really known what it takes to craft the various different beers.
Mm-hmm.
You know, what you just explained is a very simple recipe,
Mm-hmm.
but there's variations
Right.
and how you, and I would assume if you add more hops or more malt to it,
Mm-hmm.
correct? Yeah, so that makes a difference. So we'll get into the beer here very soon, but how did you come up with the name East Brother?
Yeah, it's one of those things where I mean, part of my career was spent in marketing and branding, more on the back end side, like market research, surveys, focus groups, analytics, kind of looking at, you know, what's in people's heads and feeding that information to marketing people who are coming up with names and brands and positionings and all that sort of stuff. So I have a sort of tangential familiarity with it. So I tried as much as possible, and this was one of the things we thought and we think we have going for us. We've been around a little, you know, doing our businesses and whatever, and hopefully taking that learning and applying it to this. So, on the subject of naming, we went through. It's funny. We went through a very rigorous process of looking at, you know, benchmarking the competition and looking what other people have done and looking at our values and
Isn't it weird how that is? Like naming your business is always, it seems like it's the toughest thing to do.
oh my god. So we went through this process. I mean, we must have had 500 names. I got spreadsheets, I got scores, I got weighted averages. Like I went through all the stuff that you go through, like, you know, in sort of a corporate, sort of traditional branding sense. And then we were in the car one day with a guy who is a good friend and still part of our team out of Chicago. He's a branding guy, and his name's Michael Kaiser. And we were crossing the Richmond Bridge, and he saw the sign, and it says East Brother Light Station. He's like, "Hey, what's that?" We're like, "I don't know." Like we didn't even know. And the funny thing is, nobody. It's like you guys, what's East Brother? Nobody knows what it is. A lot of people in Richmond know, and they kind of go, "Oh, thanks for naming yourself East Brother." Like we appreciate that. And it turned out like, you know, it is kind of an homage. So anyway, we looked into it and we realized what it was. It's this island. It's this lighthouse. It's been there for 150 years. It had a lot of the elements that we love about our brand and our beer in Richmond. It's quiet. It's unassuming. It's doing its thing without calling attention to itself. That's kind of our brand is kind of like that. We're not making big ostentatious, you know, face melting hot bombs. We're making kind of, we'll talk about this, right? Classic
Yeah.
styles, unassuming, easy drinking, balanced, right? And the lighthouse kind of seemed like that to us. And we just thought, God, East Brother, that's a really cool name.
It is.
It's intriguing. People are like, what is that? You know, so that's kind of how we settled on it.
Okay. Now, why did you decide to open up your brewing room or your tap room in Richmond?
Yeah, that's another.
Because, and the reason why I asked that is because I know a lot of brewing companies will try to go for Berkeley or San Francisco or Oakland and try to get the really big name city.
Yeah, yeah, and that's probably why we didn't do it in those places, because we felt like we kind of, there's a bit of a trend in beer and brewing towards innovation and experimentation and pushing the envelope, and we're a little anti-trend that way. So we didn't really make an explicit decision not to be in those bigger cities. I mean, geez, that's where you have more population. You can locate in a place with heavy foot traffic and get people coming in your tap room that way. We don't have that. We're definitely off the beaten path. But almost like the name, the way we arrived at our name, we didn't do a lot of research into a whole bunch of different places. We independently arrived at the the decision to not decision but realizing that Richmond would be a great place. Chris one day just started driving around Richmond, and the same day, we weren't together. We realized this afterwards. The same day, my sister-in-law, we were having dinner. My sister-in-law, she's like, "Where are you going to locate your brewery?" I'm like, "I don't know. We're still trying to figure it out." And she goes, "Why not? How about Richmond?" And it just something like a light bulb went off. Richmond has so much going for it. It's, proximity is amazing. It's right in the middle of the Bay Area. You're talking about a production brewery and trucking and logistics and deliveries. Like, the location's amazing. It's relatively cheap compared to, some of the other places that you mentioned. And it's got this vibe. So Chris drove around. I had it in my head, and then, a day or two later, we both drove around, and there's something about it that we really loved. It's got this, first of all, it's got this incredible heritage, right? You interviewed someone from Rosie the Riveter, so it's got that.
They're your neighbors, right?
Yeah, they're like one exit away. I mean, in World War II, I think I read somewhere Richmond built 750 ships, and when you do the math, like, okay, over a few years, that's like a ship every 3 days or something. It's
so
incredible.
you want to know an interesting fact that we learned on that podcast episode?
Yeah.
That it was the what was his name, Henry Kaiser, who started Kaiser Permanente.
Right.
Was in charge of basically putting all those ships together, organizing the housing for all the workers.
Yeah.
And it's very interesting.
And he started providing them health insurance.
And
that's what kind of led
became
over to
Permanente.
Kaiser Permanente.
Yeah, it's an amazing story. And so it has this great history, and there's something about Richmond. There's like an industry. There's like an industrial vibe to it. And like I said, we drove around and we just go, God, this is where we want to be. It's not pretentious. It's not overdone. It's just quietly doing its thing. And Richmond, I grew up in Oakland. I'm a lifetime Bay Area. I lived a couple other places during my life, but mostly in the Bay Area. And Richmond, Richmond has oftentimes it's kind of a drive-through city. Like you're in Oakland and you're going to Marin, you just drive through, right? I want people to get off the freeway now, and we're feeling so we drove around and just got this sense like this is where we need to be. And it took a long time to actually find a location, but we did, and we love it. But there's something about Richmond. I'm participating in a lot of things here. I'm working with a number of nonprofits. They're coming to us. We're doing fundraisers at our tap room. I've worked with the city pretty closely on a number of different things. We're pouring beer at Spirit and Soul tomorrow.
Oh, nice.
Down in Richmond. We've done music on the Main. I went to the city council meeting the other night where there was a vacant seat that was filled by Ada Racinos. It was a mob scene there, and there were 13 candidates to fill one seat. I mean, the meeting ended almost midnight. But my point is, there's an incredible energy in Richmond right now. People are engaged, and people are mobilized, and people are something like it's almost like it's Richmond's turn now. So there's, like I said, there's a really good vibe going on in Richmond right now, and we didn't really know that when we drove around and thought this is a cool place. It's sort of like after the fact we realized it, but we're very happy to be here.
Yeah, and you're right about that. The vibe that Richmond has right now, and it's going to be a city that I truly believe will be exploding here in the next 5 to 10 years.
Mhm.
You're starting to see even the media start to pick up on the good things about Richmond. In the past, Richmond's always had a really bad reputation,
Mhm.
and unfortunate for a very small, isolated area because Richmond's a pretty big city.
It is.
Yeah, and now you're starting to see, well, it's one of the most affordable cities in the Bay Area for what you can buy. And you're starting to see a lot of people. I mean, I do property management, and I see a lot of people from San Francisco and Oakland moving into Richmond.
Hmm.
And yeah, the city, I think there's going to be a huge demand for brewing companies, for more restaurants, for more services. And I think in 5 to 10 years, this city's going to change dramatically.
Yeah, yeah, and it has changed, and it's going to. I totally agree with that. And we see in our tap room, let's say, I don't know what percentage, but a large percentage is from Richmond and kind of the surrounding area, like Pinole, El Sobrante, Hercules, kind of that corridor up in there. And it's just we have all ethnicities. We have old people, we have young people, we got young families, we got hikers, bikers, people with dogs, kids, and it really feels like people are coming to Richmond.
Yeah, and one of the great things about beer is that it can connect a lot of people. It can reach out to every demographic.
Hmm. Yeah, that well, and you asked early on, why beer or why just there's something about beer that I mean, I love wine, I love cocktails. Beer is almost though it's like one of those things. Like, hey, you want to go have a beer? Now, there's something about just hey, let's get a beer.
Yeah.
It's just the most basic, you know, mechanism for joining people and communications. In our tap room, we have these long tables, right? We have the 9-foot tables. We have 6-foot tables we put together to make 12-foot tables, and
Okay.
so they're communal basically. And we definitely find people talking to each other. It's like someone the other day they said, "God, I was sitting there and I looked. I was sitting at a table and I realized no one was looking at their phone." And I kind of want people to look at their phone and take, post pictures of our place on Instagram, which they do. But it was nice. Like everyone was talking to each other. So we're hoping to foster that kind of nice community place.
And you know what they say, the best business happens at the bar.
That's right. That's right.
And
So-
and that's really true. I can't tell you how many deals I've actually closed by literally just grabbing the beer with a client.
Yeah.
And just sitting down, hey, let's discuss this contract, let's write an offer. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so why don't we get into the beers here?
Cool.
And let's talk about which one are we going to open up first?
We probably when we do flights, we usually do kind of light to dark, just so if you start with
Okay.
a big hoppy beer, then you almost like
Okay, so that's very similar to like wine. You go from white
yes,
to red.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. So, I brought 4. We have 5 as part of our portfolio. We distribute all 5 into restaurants and bars in kegs and cans. We've got 5 in the tap room. We had 6. We're going to have 6 again, and we'll probably get up to. The 6th was called an English pale, classic English pale ale. Basically, we ran out of it and just haven't had time to rebrew it. So, but there's some brewing now, so we'll get that back on tap, and we'll probably end up with, I don't know, maybe 8 or 10 in the tap room at some point. So we have a bunch of like tap room exclusives. The ones
Just sorry to interrupt, but is that a common problem many small brewing companies have, where if you have a very popular beer, it runs out,
Yes.
it will take you, some time to rebrew it and put it out there?
Absolutely. Yeah. And we just, to be honest, we came when we were putting in the system, the equipment, the tanks are really the bottleneck. Like we can brew a ton of beer with our system, but it's how many fermentation tanks you have and how long it takes, as you say, for the beer to sit in there. And sometimes you're sitting around looking at your watch going, okay, well, they're all full. We can't brew until at least one's done, and we empty it out and we fill it up again, right? So we've actually just purchased more tanks. They're sitting there now. We've got some construction. So actually, why Chris isn't here today, we want him to come, but he's working on getting the infrastructure in to get the tanks up and running, which should happen in a few weeks. So we've been struggling with supply for sure. So what I brought was a couple ales and a couple lagers. This also is something that we think kind of distinguishes us. We do what we call classic styles, in contrast to a lot of the, as I said earlier, innovation, experimentation going right now, which is great. Like we love all beer, and I love having those, crazy barrel aged, imperial stouts and sours that have like hibiscus, and there's all sorts of interesting things going on. But for us, the kind of beers that Chris was brewing, that we were brewing, and that we love are things like this red lager. It's a Vienna lager, very classic style. Negro Modello is a Vienna lager.
Okay.
So Bo Pils, Bohemian Pils, Czech Pilsner, basically. It's like the birth of Pils. Pilsen is where Pilsners were created, and this is a very classic style as well. Oatmeal Stout, very classic English style. Stuff like Samuel Smith. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but it's an old English
I've
brand.
heard of it. Yeah, I've never tried it.
Got a great oatmeal stout. And then red IPA is, I'm not sure what, well, IPA actually is a classic style. It's been around for a few hundred years. It was almost dead a few decades ago, and then it was revived by places like Lagunitas with IPA,
Yep.
Russian River with their Pliny the Elder. I don't know if you've heard of that one. They have Pliny the Elder.
I've had it too.
Yeah. So, and those are phenomenal beers. And now IPAs, I don't know if, like, within craft beer at least, like all beer, including Bud Miller Coors, lagers are definitely light. It's called American Light Lager. That style, that's the biggest volume in this country. But if you look at craft beer only, IPA is probably the biggest style. It's probably, I don't know, a quarter or a third of all volume.
Okay.
So
Now, what makes a difference between an IPA, a double, and a triple IPA?
hops.
Hops.
How many?
Just
hops?
more hops.
How many? More hops. More hops. More hops. Yeah, exactly. The basic malt, the malt bill, which is the kinds of malts and how much you put in is similar. The yeast is similar, but the more hops you put in, and the more you put in at different times. Some of these styles, like a pilsner, you don't dry hop it. Dry hopping is putting hops in the fermenter while it's fermenting. You do the hops early and you put in the fermenter and let it go. IPAs, you put hops in like all through the process, including at the end, which is dry hopping. So yeah, the more you put in, the more flavor, the more aroma, the bigger it is. And those double and triples also have.
They get a bit more bitter too.
Yeah, but that comes from the hops.
Okay.
Yeah, so I mean, the whole thing with beer is the reason hops were introduced was, malt, as I mentioned earlier, has sugar. So the sugar comes out of the starches, and if you don't have hops, it's just sweet and cloying. So hops were introduced a couple reasons. One, as a preservative, but also as a bitter balance to the sweet sugar.
Okay.
So you got the malts, sugar, you got the hops and the bitterness, and a balance is important. I should also say the difference between single, double, triple, as you were asking, also has to do with the alcohol and the amount of alcohol produced by the yeast eating the sugar. So the more sugar you put in, the more the yeast can eat it and create more alcohol. So you have higher alcohol with doubles and triples.
So that's the incredible thing. When you're creating a beer, you have to keep all this in mind, and you're crafting and adjusting all these different levels to come up with one beer.
Yeah. So like I said, the variations are infinite. Yeah. So I mean, these are all drastically different from each other. And there's, of course, like hundreds of styles out there. It's only 4. So
Okay.
So you want to
light to dark.
All right. Yeah.
That's...
Well, and actually, I think we'll go. It's funny. This one, even though the color is darker, which you'll see, because again,
the red lager.
The red lager. The alcohol is 4.6 on this one. The Pils is around 5%, I think. So this is actually the lightest in terms of alcohol. The lightest in color is here, but they're both very crisp. So anyway, let's. All right, here we go.
Jim, you want a glass?
There's one. And you always want to pour with a little head. Sometimes you go into a bar and they'll make it flat right up the top with no head, but you really do want some head because the bubbles are a vehicle for the aroma. And of course, the aroma is a good, as you guys know, drinking wine, aroma is a big component of flavor.
Yeah.
So this is, as I said, this is a Vienna lager. It's not meant to be hoppy at all. It's meant to be pretty dry, toasty, biscuity, crisp. You'll smell probably some bread in there, some nuttiness. You get a little bit of.
I definitely get the bread.
Yeah. It's a malt. All our beers are very malt forward, so they're definitely hops in them. But they're hops. In this one at least, it's hops to balance everything.
Very smooth.
Yeah, it's a very drinkable beer. This one, it's funny. We go out we sell at restaurants and bars, and we've got an IPA, and we'll bring all our beers, and oftentimes we'll hear, well, I love your IPA, but I have got 30 IPAs already. But the red lager, I don't like that could fill a slot that I don't have.
So, yeah, this is really, really delicious.
Yeah, I love the finish on this one too. It's got a little bit of brown sugar, but not overwhelming. But the breadiness is what I love the most about it.
It's the crispness that goes with it too.
Yeah, yeah.
That I like a lot also. That's what I like most about reds. It's like they have that the heavy taste, but they're also very crisp. If it's hot out, you can drink it without feeling super thirsty afterwards.
Yeah, yeah.
And this is easily a beer you can match up with any food.
Oh, totally.
And
Totally.
that's the amazing thing right now about beer is that it's just like wine nowadays. You can literally match it up with foods, and just the evolution of beer making, the craft of brewing beer has just evolved to a whole nother level.
Totally.
That's amazing right
The beer
now.
food pairing thing is kind of going crazy right now. There's a lot of events that go on, and chefs looking at the different beers they have and pairing them specifically. Oh, and using beer in food as well. Like some of our food trucks that come, we have a barbecue truck that comes, and they use our oatmeal stout in their chili,
Oh wow.
and they braise some of their meat in the pills. And it's like, cool. You can drink you can have the food with the beer, and the food's also made with the beer.
Yeah.
So
I've heard of beer cheese, but yeah, doing stouts and chili.
oh yeah, good stuff.
Yeah. Now, what would you pair with this red lager?
Oh God, that's not my specialty. Because I love every beer, and I usually find myself eating food and drinking a beer, and just sort of after the fact realizing, oh, this is a good pairing. This would probably go well with, and I'm just saying this because I had it not too long ago. We had a taco truck, and it was those little tacos that you get from a taco truck, like the Al
The street
Pastor,
tacos,
and
yep.
yeah, like a bunch of those, and I was having it with the red lager, and it was just really, it was.
It's funny that you said that. As soon as I smelled this beer,
Mhm.
I almost said wine there because we're drinking out of a wine glass. But as soon as I smelled this beer, it reminded me a bit of Mexican food.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, the funny thing about this style, and Negro Modello, and Dos Equis has a Vienna lager as well. This was an offshoot of like Marzen and Oktoberfest, those kind of beers.
Okay.
It's a little lighter than those, but in the 19th century, brewers from Austria emigrated to Mexico, and that style, the Vienna lager, they brought Vienna lager to Mexico, which is why you have Negro Modello and Dos Equis, and this style is very popular in Mexico.
Wow.
Yeah.
Oh, that's
cool.
fact. Yeah,
Yeah,
very
yeah.
cool. I even got a little bit of cherry on the smell.
Nice.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's the fascinating thing about yeast, beer yeast, lager yeast, ale yeast is there's all sorts of things that can come out of them. And it's subjective too. Like one person can get
It is.
something, and another person doesn't get it all. It's like, do you smell this? I don't get that at all. How can you not smell that? We have these tasting sessions all the time where we're always debating and discussing what we're getting out of the aromas.
Yeah, and that depends on everyone's smell receptors and their own palate.
Yeah. And actually, Chris was telling me this. He believes, and I think he's right, that the palate is the most receptive between 10 and 12. I'm sure it's different for everyone. It depends on what you had for breakfast and if you had coffee and brush your teeth and all those things. But sometimes, like at the end of the day, you've been drinking whatever, coffee, you've been eating food, your palate becomes more deadened towards the end of the day. It kind of stands to reason, right?
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of the tasting we do is prior to lunch.
Interesting. Now, how many beers do you taste on a daily basis?
Well, I
because you have 6 primary or 5, right?
Yeah.
Primary brews.
Usually usually a couple at least, because we always have a whole bunch fermenting, and there are different stages of fermentation, and we're tasting them before, it's while it's fermenting, so it's not fully carbed. One of the things we do with our beers is filter them. One of the costs of building this place. So we bought this filter, and it's a big piece of machinery that clarifies the beer. Because when you brew, you have proteins, you have yeast, you got hot matter, leafy stuff. We whirlpool it as part of the process, but even so, when it's in the fermentation tank, it can be sort of muddy or hazy, and we feel like the look of the beer is very important. I don't know if you noticed the red lager, but it's very clear.
Yeah.
But prior to that, we're tasting it and trying to get a sense for what we're tasting, and is there any off flavors, and how does this compare to prior batches and stuff like that. So,
And how much does this equipment cost? Like these giant tanks and filters?
too much. And of course, there's an incredible range. Like we're looking at a canning line right now.
Do you buy them all brand new, or do you buy used?
You can get used, but we didn't. We bought, and I think of all the ones we looked at, I think we might have bought the most expensive one. But we're very happy with it. We're very, I mean, we're talking, well up into the six figures. I mean, you can go to seven figures easily as well. I mean, we're definitely there in terms of all the costs of opening the brewery, and we're doing this with loans and our savings. Basically, we got small business loans, and I'm continuing to get more to help with it. But yeah, it is not insignificant. Yeah, for sure.
And then your distribution, you said you're in a lot of restaurants, are you in stores?
Yeah. I don't know if I would say a lot. We're probably in between 50 and 60 places right now around the Bay Area, mostly in the East Bay, some in San Francisco, some in Marin. We've actually, past few months, we haven't been able to go out and get more because we're selling all the beer we're making. So until we get the new tanks and get more flow, we're sort of stuck with the number that we're at. We're very happy with it. But yeah, we're restaurants, bars. We're not in like larger grocery chains, but we're in like liquor stores and bottle shops and places like that.
Yeah.
We're in a couple small grocery stores.
Okay. Let's move on to the next beer here.
Right.
Yeah.
So let's do the Bo Pils. So again, this is a classic Czech Pilsner. This batch actually is a little bigger than our prior batches, meaning it's a little hoppier, but it's still a very drinkable beer. There we go here. Kind of nice out of a wine glass, right?
Yeah, it is.
Much
Feels
better.
fancy.
Well, that's funny. It's another thing in beer is like the kind of glass that you have. You got it in like champagne flutes and white wine glasses and red wine glasses.
And there's also red cab glasses. There's some Merlot glasses.
Oh my God. Yeah,
like if you
same
really
thing.
want to nerd out on that, they have a glass for every type of wine.
Exactly.
Same thing for beer?
Oh yeah, you got tulips, you got pilsners, you got like, there's a whole.
Now, in your opinion, do they really make a difference when it comes to taste and smell?
I think it can. I think it can smell, particularly like if you have something that's, got a big bouquet to it. You want something that is going to hold it in one sense, so it doesn't let it all out. So that when you put your nose up there, it's sitting there, and it allows you to experience that.
Okay.
Right. So this is a Pils. So this is, basically.
And I love the smell too. Like when you mention classic, when you smell these, you smell like a classic beer for each one.
Yeah.
Like I really like that.
So this one is, this is probably more lemony, a little grassy maybe. The hops used are what are called noble hops. There's a set of hops that fall under this category of noble hops that are in classic Pilsners. They're European hops. They're not grown here.
Now, how do you decide what beers to make?
Well, yeah, and this should have some bitterness at the back, and this will have a bigger bitterness than the red lager, but hopefully a pleasant and a pleasing bitterness. So
It's very light.
Yeah. You can drink a couple pints of this, you'll be fine too. Yeah. That's another reason we're making. To partially answer your question, how do we decide what beers to make? One of the things we want to do is we want to have some beers that were easy drinking, and we think all of them are easy drinking. The one I didn't bring was a wheat IPA. That's a 7.3. So you know, if you drink a couple pints of that, you probably shouldn't drive. You know?
Yeah.
Whereas the red lager, you know, you'd probably be okay, depending on your whatever, your tolerance and weight and all that stuff. But yeah, I mean, the ones we have now are the ones we had been brewing. So that's kind of what we started with. We are now at the point, you know, you were talking about, we have our 1 year coming up. We want to release a new beer for that. So we got to decide which one there is. We've been talking about different kinds, like doing a Belgian beer, which requires different yeast. So it's a little complicated. Like something like a Schwartz beer, which is a black lager.
Okay.
That's really interesting.
I don't think I've ever tried one of those.
It's not a super common style, which is kind of why we like it.
Okay.
We want to do things that are, again, sort of anti-trend. We don't want to do things that are anti-trend, but it seems like the things we gravitate towards are not what everyone else is doing.
So you guys go more classic because yesterday I had a event for the Young Professionals Network. Sam was there, and we were at Fourth Floor over in Orinda, and they have their beer list, and every beer, the names of the beer, the descriptions are just getting more and more elaborate. It seems like every year.
Yeah.
And so you're keeping it very classic as opposed to just trying to be the I don't know how to say this, like the next oddball that might make it big.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. You know, there's always going to be trends. The IPAs are a big trend, and that I think that's a trend. I don't think that's a trend anymore. I think that's just something that's here to stay. But sours were big for a while, and if you're familiar with that
yes,
style.
I was down in Morro Beach. No, Morro Bay, sorry. And my dad and I went on a golfing trip, and we're down at this pub, and they had sour beer, and I had never tried it, so I asked for a glass.
Wild, right? When you first
It's
try it?
wild,
Yeah.
and I had the most mild one that they had.
Yeah.
They had about 3 of them, and talk about a sour, like it just hits you everywhere.
Right.
Just yeah, it's
And
like biting into lemon.
Yeah, that's one we've considered. I'm not quite sold on it yet, but I think it's bigger in the Midwest, where it's like super hot and damp and humid and sweaty, and then like that sour beer, that can be a very refreshing, sort of bracing.
Yeah, the first few sips were very different. Like if you've never tried it before, it's very odd. It's very just wild out there. But after a few sips, you start to get used to it. Your palate adjusts, and I really enjoyed it.
Yeah. So that's an interesting style. That's been sort of trendy for a while. The one that's super trendy right now is New England hazy IPAs.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. The ones that look like orange juice or even like a milkshake.
Yeah, I just had one yesterday. A hazy IPA.
Yeah, how'd you like it?
It was okay.
It's, as opposed to the West Coast style of IPA, which is, as you were saying earlier, bitter. That's one of the defining characters. Very hoppy, very bitter. New England IPAs they're more like juicy and fruity and sweet, and they don't have the bitterness on the back end. Sometimes they do, but I think one of the defining characteristics is that it's not super bitter. But we're sort of just looking at the beers that we like and that we think would fit well in terms of our, again, kind of unassuming brand and more classic and familiar. I mean, even the look of our brand is very. People look at that and they think like, old Milwaukee or the Brooklyn Dodgers or something like that.
Yankees.
Right. Exactly. Yep. So it's a font that people look at and there's a familiarity. It's like, there's an affinity for that, and that's kind of and our simplistic sort of minimalist look also is very purposeful. We want it to be something that just not overwrought.
And so that comes from your marketing background then.
Yeah, with help from our branding people. Yeah. But we went through that process of describing who we are and what our values are and what we aspire to, and all that stuff gets distilled down, and we look at this and we're like, that's us.
Yeah,
we love it. We're really very
How long did it take for you to design and get that logo?
It was a process of, boy, I don't know, like a year, probably 6-8 months maybe. But we did like mood boards and stuff where we, what kind of stuff do you like? Throw it up there and, get a visual sense for like the direction you're going in, and then you kind of distill that down to this.
Yeah.
So that's the Pils.
That's very good.
Yeah.
It's good. Now, recently there's been a big boom in craft beer. Why is that?
Yeah, it is really interesting. We didn't really we didn't really realize it when we decided to do this. Once I started looking, we noticed that things were popping up and new beers were showing up and new breweries were showing up. But really, when you look at the numbers, it's as we were talking before, it's amazing. I mean, back in the
You said
pro,
there were 100 craft
something
beer
like
companies.
that, something like that. I mean, back in the like the 19 well, yeah, 19th century, there were thousands. Prohibition killed a lot, and there were so only the big, there were big guys after prohibition was repealed through for the next number of decades into the 80s. I think in the 80s there were a few few hundred, something like that. And then with places like Sierra Nevada and Anchor had been around a long time, although Anchor now purchased by Sapporo, so they're not independent anymore. They're technically a big conglomerate.
Yeah.
Guys like Sierra Nevada and Lagunitas in the 90s and a handful of others, they kind of started this, but it really started booming because now there's, I think this year, by the end of this year, there'll probably be like 6,000 or more than 6,000.
Wow.
It's an amazing growth. I think it's consistent with everything else we've seen in our lives with regard to, specifically with regard to food. In the 50s and 60s and 70s, it was like the agro-industrial complex making Wonder Bread and American cheese and everything. Everything was sort of processed and all the goodness stripped out of it, and made in a big factory somewhere, nobody knows where, and this movement towards local and organic and sustainable and artisanal and farmers markets and people wanting to know what's in their food, where it's produced, who's producing it's a giant movement, right? Across all food categories, coffee to chocolate to cheese to pretzels to pickles to whatever,
Yeah.
And beer, I think, is really just part of that. People want to know what's in it and where it's made, and the thing with beer, though, too, because we can have a tap room, we can have people come and sit at a table and look at that tank and go, "That's where it was made, right there." It's like there's no that's it, and there's also, getting back to our earlier comments about Richmond, there's a pride, and there's an ownership.
Yeah,
And a
Richmond,
feeling
city of pride.
Yeah, exactly. Pride and purpose.
Yep.
So all those things together, I think, really contribute to why people want to have their own little craft brewery, and they want to support it. And so I see that trend continuing until there is, I suppose, a saturation point at
Yeah.
some time, but hopefully not soon.
Yeah. Now you mentioned organic, and I've seen some beers label organic beer.
Mm-hmm.
What makes it organic, or how do they get that authorization to label it organic?
Yeah, I don't know the answer to that question definitively, because as we know with anything, there's a lot of debate and controversy, not controversy necessarily, but questions about, okay, this says organic, but there's all these different standards and all these different organizations and regulatory components to what is actually what qualifies as organic. But my understanding, at least in terms of beer, is the stuff going into it. So the malt was grown, the grains were grown, the barley or wheat or oats or whatever they put in there is grown organically on an organic farm. Same with the hops. So what they're putting in there, yeast probably. Actually, you know what? I think I listened to a podcast not too long ago about yeast, and guys were doing organic yeast. So same kind of thing. I don't know how that would work because it's all in a petri dish basically. But
Yeah.
we buy our yeast in bags. So yeah, I mean the ingredients are certified to be organic. That's my understanding.
Okay.
Yeah.
Now, one thing we were talking about earlier, and you just mentioned about the increase in the number of brewing companies,
Mhm.
and now we're looking at over 6,000. One of the questions I had for you is, do you see the number of beer sales increasing because of this, or do you see them just overtaking a market share?
It's the latter for sure. Yeah, overall beer sales in the country they've been flat-ish, maybe declining a little bit. Wine, and it's always this wine, spirits, and beer. They're always like competing with each other, right? But beer overall has been pretty flat. So the growth in craft beer has definitely come at the expense of the big macro beers like Bud, Miller, Coors.
Okay. Do you think sometime in the future though that could change with all the craft beers coming out? More and more people doing their own unique thing, and maybe a trend of consumers going from the I'll call it an old school, old
Mhm.
generation beer
Hmm.
to the newer generation of craft brewing.
Oh, definitely. Yeah. I mean, it's interesting to see the people we get in the tap room and looking on our social media. We try to be as active as possible and who's following us and what they're doing. And we talk to as many people as possible. But millennials are an interesting group. Of course, they're huge, right?
Yep.
Um,
They're bigger than baby boomers right now.
right, right. Um, and one of the key things I've seen with millennials and the data I've looked at and the people I've talked to is women. A lot of women millennials love beer. And I don't think you necessarily saw that with Gen Xers or boomers. I think Gen Xers and maybe I'm totally, could be totally like generalizing here,
You know,
but
I've seen the same thing though.
yeah, I mean, my wife, so she's in her 50s. Now she loves beer and beers are drinking. But for years, it was like she'd go for a glass of wine or she'd go for a cocktail. Still drinks both, of course. but we have one of our taproom servers in her interview. The very first thing she said was, first of all, I want you guys to know, she's like 23 years old. I want you guys to know my drink of choice is beer. So it's like I don't think you would hear that 20 years ago. So I think if you're asking about volume and beer and where it's going, I absolutely think there's a lot of upside given the size of millennials and the fact that there's so many interesting choices compared to 20 or 30 years
Yeah. Yeah. The studies with millennials and alcohol purchases, mainly beer and wine, is very interesting to look at that data. Now, I was looking at the data with wine purchases. Millennials drink just as much, if not more, wine
ago.
than their parents and
Hmm.
older generations, but they tend to not like to buy the bottle.
Hmm.
They'll buy a glass, or what's very popular are the half bottles.
Oh, right.
And so there's various companies right now that are doing uh, like automated shipment,
Hmm.
kind of like Dollar Shave Club or like joining the wine club,
Direct to consumer.
direct to
Yes,
consumer.
right, right.
And they're half bottles. They give them variations, and apparently that's what they're consuming, and that's what they prefer.
Interesting.
Yeah,
It's almost like a beer flight
yeah,
or a wine flight,
yeah.
right? Like,
Correct. Yeah,
do I want a whole bunch of one thing or do I want smaller amounts of several things? That way I can sort of, taste a
yeah,
whole, get a better, a broader experience.
yeah. Is that something you think you guys will do in the future, like a
Oh,
beer club?
oh, that's an interesting. You know what? I've gotten a bunch of emails from like apps and services that are doing direct to consumer, and I just have not had the time to turn my ears there. But yeah, man, if they're direct to consumer, I'd love to do that. The flight thing we definitely do. Like in our tap room, whenever someone comes in for the first time, they're like, "What should I try?" We're like, "Hey, let's try a flight." Do a flight, and they pick one they like and get a pint.
And how much is a flight?
Flight of four is $8.
Oh, that's cheap.
Yeah, it's not bad. Yeah,
Yeah,
that's a couple. What is it? 4 or 5 ounces, I think,
yeah.
of each. Yeah,
Wow.
we try to. It's beer, so we don't want to be too over the top. Although funny, there's definitely upward price pressure in beer. Guys that are doing like the barrel aged stuff with the wax top like wine
Yeah,
and selling it for like $32 a bottle. I'm like, oh my god, I'd love to do that, but
yeah. And a lot of that comes down to presentation
yeah,
and experience. And many times you're not paying for a better beer; you're just paying for the presentation.
yes,
Yeah.
yes. So
Okay.
all right,
So
I'll crack another.
yeah, let's go to the next one
So
here.
let's see. I'm trying to think. Maybe let's do the red IPA. I mean, it's a big hoppy beer, but then the oatmeal stout um, also it's a pretty flavorful beer. So let's
Now, how will the
do
red IPA differ from a normal IPA?
well, so IPA, first of all, there was just IPA, like Lagunitas IPA. That's just like straight up regular IPA. There's nothing fancy or derivative about it. But now, of
Do you think
course,
that became like the basic standard for
oh
IPAs?
yeah, yeah. I mean, that label, it's so iconic, right?
Yeah.
IPA, right? Um, but of course, when a category gets big, then people start experimenting, and there's all these different offshoots of different kinds of IPA. This one we call it red IPA because we put a little more toasted malt in there, and really the color of a beer is determined by the degree of toastiness of the malt, I guess.
Okay.
Like a light beer just has all pale malt. an oatmeal stout has some roasted, toasted malt, just gives it its color. We have a little bit of that in here. It also imparts some nice flavor. So this one, do you know the brewery called Deschutes?
No.
Deschutes. They're in Oregon. They have there's a beer they have called Fresh Squeezed.
Yeah. I
Oh.
had that just a few weeks ago.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So
I have tried that.
I think one of your questions you had asked earlier was like, were we inspired by anything? And this beer is kind of inspired by that because it's very fruity. This beer, it only has 2 kinds of hops in it, but the one called Mosaic tends to be like stone fruit, nectarine, peach. You tend to get a lot of that in the nose.
I smell the nectarine.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, right off the bat.
Yeah, it's again it's a little on the sweeter side, although it does has and it's meant at least to have a clean finish. I'll leave that to you guys if you think so, but yeah, we try to all the beers we're doing we try to be very balanced. Even the IPA, it's certainly not shouldn't be getting a big bitterness at the end like a puckering bitterness. There's a little bitterness, but we're trying to do things that are very easy drinking and balanced.
There's a hint
This
to let
beer-
you know that's there. But yeah, you definitely it doesn't smack you in the face.
Yeah.
Right.
This beer literally felt like it just hugged my tongue. like
Yeah,
like from left to right, front to back, it just hugged my tongue.
yeah, it's a good description, Mark. For an IPA, it's definitely a malt forward IPA.
It's very tasty.
Thank you.
It's
This
good.
is our most popular. Yeah,
So
it's
I
amazing.
got a question. For IP, what's the difference between an IPA versus just a pale ale?
The answer to that question, it's almost the answer to Mark's question about single, double, triple. It's hops.
Just
Pale ale is
hop
basically an
content?
IPA with fewer hops. It's still basically the same. It's got, like if you drink a Sierra Nevada pale ale, that's like the classic pale ale. It's definitely hoppy, but if you put it next to an IPA, it pales. Pardon the pun. Yeah, the one we had that's our taproom exclusive, an English pale, tastes like a calmer version of Sierra Nevada pale ale.
I had a little bit. I just got a little bit of a flower on the very tip of my tongue.
Nice.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's definitely some floral components to the esters that the yeast produces. Yeah.
This is really good.
Thank you.
It seems like it would pair really well with any light meats, like chicken, fish.
For sure.
Definitely the red lager with street tacos.
Yeah. Yep. And then we also have the one that we don't have right now available was a wheat IPA, and that one's it's more like on the citrus side. So this is more stone fruit, a little sweeter. The wheat IPA has wheat in it, so it got a little bit of a different mouthfeel, a little more viscous. But it also the hops that are in that one are more grapefruity, and kind of rindy. So it's more like a traditional IPA.
Okay. So when are your tap rooms open?
So we're open 5 days a week. We're open Wednesday through Sunday. Wednesday, Thursday, Friday we open at 4, and Saturday, Sunday we open at noon.
Okay.
And we close at like 8 or 9.
Okay.
Around there. Yeah. And we're really happy with the place we had. We were talking earlier about Richmond and places we looked at a whole bunch of different places, and we needed somewhere like a big warehouse with tall ceilings, and we found this great place. It's a huge warehouse. We're only one, unit within the warehouse, but it was like a blank canvas, just a big empty box. We, outfitted it with everything and put all the plumbing and the electrical and the concrete, and so part of it is the brew house, part of it's the tap room. We've got some offices in the back. We've got expansion space, which we're now starting to use. But it's great because it's up against the hillside. It's up by Miller Knox Regional Shoreline Regional
Okay.
Park, and it's right by a bunch of hiking trails. And our tap room opens onto a patio that overlooks the hill. So we've got this big outdoor space. We've got a bocce court, got ping pong table,
And you have food
cornhole.
trucks that show up
We
too.
have food trucks every day. Yeah. So it's a little oasis back there.
Yeah.
Like I said, it's a little hard to find. We got a bunch of signs out on the street to lead people there, but we're very pleased so far with the way it's turning out.
And do you usually have like one food truck, or are there multiples?
Usually one.
Okay.
Yeah. We have kind of a rotating set of food trucks. We're trying to work with in anything. Like all the vendors we work with, we're trying to work with Richmond-based companies. We've got, I think most of the food trucks we have are from Richmond or the immediate surrounding environment.
Okay, great. So the final one we have is a stout.
Yep.
Now, I'm going to assume this stout is a very dark color.
Yes.
Now, why is it that stouts usually come out like looking black?
It's the malt, the roast malt, basically. So the base malts are pale malts, but then you have a bunch of toasted malt, roasted malt that you add to it, and the malting process is a whole industry to itself. It's really pretty fascinating. You let barley germinate, and you put it in water, let it germinate, and then you stop and you kiln it. You put it in a kiln and kind of fire it to dry it, and then some of the malt you toast to the point where it's almost like dark brown or black, and we put a fair amount of that in the oatmeal stout, so that gives it its color.
And why did you name it oatmeal stout?
Well, we have oats in it. So the base malts for most beer are barley. People sometimes add wheat, sometimes they add corn, sometimes they add rye, sometimes they add oats. And oatmeal stout, I mentioned Samuel Smith. It's a classic style. You add oats, and oats, like think of oatmeal. It's a little slimy, right? It's not a good descriptor.
Yeah.
But it's also silky. So when you put it in beer, it gives it kind of a silky mouthfeel. So if you have a stout like an Irish, like a Guinness or something, if you had this next to a Guinness, the Guinness tastes very dry, almost a little thin. This has a little more viscosity to it, a little silkiness.
Okay.
So let's try it and see what you think. You guys gonna be all right continuing your day after this?
Oh yeah.
So I said that the malts impart the color, but they also, of course, have flavor, right?
Okay.
So stouts have coffee, they have chocolate, they have tobacco.
I had a peanut butter stout the other day.
Oh, I have not tried that, but I've heard about that. What do you think?
It's very interesting. It's heavy in the peanut butter when you taste it.
Is there actual peanuts in it? I guess so, right? Peanut butter or peanuts?
Yeah, Yeah, it must be. Yeah, but so you get a heavy taste of peanut butter. And then so it's kind of like the sour beer. So it's very odd at first, but after a few sips, your palate gets used to it, and then it gets very comfortable to drink, and then it starts to taste good. And I think it's one of those where you just have to get used to it.
Yeah.
And then you can really enjoy all the flavors.
Yeah.
And then you start picking up on other flavors besides peanut butter.
Right.
Yeah, so it's very interesting. Yeah, I definitely recommend it if you can find a peanut. I know they sell it at Rayleigh's here in El Sobrante.
I'll look for it.
Yeah.
I'm sure they put peanut butter or peanuts in it. So this one, there's like some raisin in here you might get. There's like prune and raisin. There's a little fruitiness, but there also should be some chocolate, some coffee.
I'm definitely smelling the oats.
This is one of my favorite.
I just want to smell it.
Yeah. So the interesting thing about stouts too is a lot of people think that stouts are big in flavor and also big in alcohol. This is a 5.4, I think, 5.4%. So this is not really far from these guys. So you actually can drink a pint and walk away and be fine. Now there's like barrel aged imperial stouts that are like 10 and 12% that are almost like a glass of wine. But this one is very, very drinkable.
It is. It's very smooth. So much like you said, very silky.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's exactly what it's like. It's very smooth. And it's funny, my girlfriend, Kim, she's never been a beer drinker. Never. But then she tried a stout, and she loves stouts.
Interesting.
She still can't drink all the other beers, but stout is like her favorite.
That's exact same as my sister-in-law. So she's not a beer drinker at all. She likes wine and cocktails, but our stout she loves. And so whenever we go over there, I like bring a can. She's like, oh, thanks. But it's funny. It's like she doesn't like regular beer. Yeah. It's almost like a different drink. I mean, wine has this as well, but beer. The other great thing about beer is there's this incredible diversity across the spectrum of styles that you can make and you can drink.
Now this one is a very smooth stout, and definitely the difference between this one and like a Guinness And it seems like many beer makers will try to make their stouts similar to Guinness.
Hmm.
And something like I'll be honest, I'm not a huge fan of stouts. I really love this one, but I'm not a huge fan of stouts because they really go heavy, go extremely bold and dry.
Hmm. Hmm.
This one is very smooth. I mean, it's easily drinkable, just like all the other beers.
Hmm. Thank you. Appreciate it, Mark.
Yeah, you can smell a little chocolate too.
Chocolate and the oats. Yeah, it's a good mix.
Excellent. Good. Yeah, it's funny to talk about the peanut butter and Okay, so there's definitely oats in here, but chocolate, coffee, raisins. The fascinating thing about beer and wine too, those things aren't in the beer,
Yeah.
right? That's all coming out of the interplay of the malt and the hops and the yeast, depending on the style. There are brewers do add stuff. Sometimes they add cocoa, or sometimes they add coffee. Sometimes they add peanut butter.
Yeah.
So you can't. And like that Deschutes fresh squeezed, I'm not sure if they may add some sort of fruit. That's another trend now. Fruit beer, blood orange or what else? There's
I know Shock Top does a lot of fruit beers.
yeah. So we like just having 4 ingredients in the beer and letting the flavors sort of come out of them for now.
I'm going to fall in love with stouts again because of this.
Good to hear.
It's
Good to
very
hear.
smooth. Like, it's incredible.
Well, come on by the tap room. You can have fresh on draft.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, for sure. Okay, well, we've exceeded the time limit that we normally have on.
Oh my
the
God, you're kidding.
That's the funny thing about these podcasts is that time flies by so quick on
It really
these.
does.
Yeah. 30, 40 minutes, it's sometimes not even enough time, or an hour. We're past an hour right now.
Wow.
Yeah. So I want to thank you for coming out.
Thank you.
And
Appreciate
just what's your address for the tap room?
1001 Canal Boulevard.
Okay.
Yeah, so it's a little tricky to find. Got a bunch of signs out. If you're at the corner of Cutting and Canal, just go south on Canal towards the water. We're on the right side, about a mile down. Follow the signs, and we're up against the hillside.
Okay, perfect. So we'll link up the website and link up the various beers here so people can, listening on the podcast can actually go online and visually see what we're drinking. But thank you for coming out.
Thank you so much.
And it's phenomenal beer.
Awesome. Thanks,
Yeah.
Mark. Appreciate it.
Thanks. Wow, what an episode. Thank you so much for listening, and thank you to our producer, Sam Lubman. Big shout out to Rob Lightner of East Brother Beer Company for visiting us on today's podcast. For all you beer fans, you seriously need to try East Brother Beer. Go to their website, and they have a great user-friendly interactive map showing every location where their beer is sold, in stores, restaurants, shops, etc. All the beers were fantastic, but I have to say my favorite was definitely the stout, and this beer has renewed my enjoyment of stouts. Also, please like, comment, and share the podcast. Your feedback is much appreciated. Don't forget to show us some love and rate the podcast on iTunes or anywhere else you listen to podcasts. Thank you. I really, really want to thank all of you for listening. It means the world to me, and I hope today's episode provides you value in your day-to-day life. I created this podcast to help showcase the many great people that live in this world and help share some knowledge that I've learned along the way in life. Again, thank you for listening. Check out our sponsors, and I'll catch you on the next episode.